Hey everyone, well this is it. Just Cause 4, running here on a Core i9 9900K system paired with a GTX 1080 Ti, max settings, 4K resolution. It's shaping up to be a demanding game, but that's kind of the point of this video. What we're looking at here is pre-final code, and crucially, yeah, we don't have any kind of optimized GPU driver in place yet. And yet, Square Enix was still perfectly fine, inviting me into their London office to take a look at the game to illustrate that the firm is aware of the issues, the controversies that surrounded the launch of Just Cause 3, and that we won't be looking at a repeat of that this time around. So yeah, back in the day, the PC version of JC3 launched with some severe performance and loading time problems, and some really bad stutter on AMD cards. Obviously, without final optimizations in place and without day one drivers, you can't really benchmark the PC version of the game fully and accurately right now, but first impressions are certainly suggesting that the PC launch should be much smoother this time around. Loading times are a lot faster, to the point where Square Enix even demoed the game loading up from a 2.5-inch laptop drive, and as for overall performance, well, it's looking pretty good. What I am aware of though is that there'll be a big bunch of console users out there wondering why we're focusing on PC now and not on the PS4 and Xbox One versions of the game. Truth is that we're still waiting for final optimizations on those versions, but again, Square Enix tells us that this has been a real focus for developer Avalanche. We'll do our best to get a pre-launch look at that, but after checking with Square Enix's technical director for external studios, I'd say that there are good reasons to be optimistic here. More on that in a bit. All of which is kind of secondary to the absolute carnage that's breaking out on screen as I speak. I mean, this is Just Cause. So the basic formula is likely to be familiar. You've got a new open world to explore, and yes, while there are specific missions, there's still that freedom to go where you please, do what you want, and generally cause absolute chaos. Just Cause obviously revels in its destruction. The Apex open world engine utilized Havoc physics to portray some absolutely crazy stuff, but here's the thing. Just Cause isn't just about the freedom and flexibility of the open world, it's about intelligently using the systems of the game, the physics stuff specifically, to make stuff like this happen. There's not just freedom in where you go, but in what you do. And it's these systems that have really been pushed further this time around. And that brings us on to the first area where Avalanche has rethought the technology behind the game. We know from the console versions of Just Cause 3 that the physics system could create huge bottlenecks and performance drops, and we were told that the threading of this system was fairly limited. The solution for Just Cause 4 is a substantial revamp of the way the CPU is utilized, with the work spread across more cores. Pretty much the only way to get the most out of the current gen consoles, but with obvious knock-on benefits for the PC, where many core CPUs are gaining traction. So yes, as you can see from the footage, the potential with the physics system results in some remarkable and indeed hilarious results. It's also possible to extensively customize Rico's loadout. So for example, boosters can be attached to anything to send people, scenery, or vehicles flying into the skies. Just Cause 4 also sees a really exciting new development to the system, as you've probably picked up on by now, the introduction of weather systems, including a full-on typhoon. Okay, so we've seen adverse weather conditions from the Apex engine before, specifically in Avalanche's Mad Max, but rest assured this system has been rebuilt from the ground up for Just Cause 4. So the Twister here is an ever-present feature on the map, and it can take center stage in some of the missions here too. Now obviously it represents a new challenge for the player, something we've not seen in Just Cause before, but more than that, it's a further stress test for the game's physics systems. The Twister represents so much force, so much energy in game that it's easily capable of sending multiple jumbo jets up into the air as it plows through the airfield on the map here. So The kind of carnage it could wreak on an enemy base, for example, would be pretty much unprecedented for the series. But what I like about it over and above the spectacle is the fact that really for the first time in a Just Cause game, we get much more in the way of what you might call ambient physics and destruction. Previously, RICO was the centerpiece for the insanity that occurs in game. Now we have an unpredictable, massively powerful force of nature out there in the open world. In some of the footage we've been showing here, you get some sense of what it's capable of, and of course, how well it's rendered. Based on what I've seen so far, I also think that Just Cause 4 deserves some appreciation for what you might call background invisible systems that make an open world possible. So yeah, working with an open world creates a pretty intense challenge for the CPU. The faster you can move across the terrain, the more data needs to be streamed in, decompressed and then processed, rendered. Level of detail also needs to be carefully managed. Constrain detail too much and you get pop-in and or low poly count structures that can really stick out. Too much detail can cause CPU bottlenecking in sending instructions to the GPU on top of the rendering itself. As it is, Just Cause 4 allows for low-level, high-speed flying over terrain. Pretty much the nightmare scenario for streaming systems. Based on the PC version we're looking at here, at least it holds up, but then, you'd expect that from a 9900K CPU. But I suspect that the system here is rather more robust, so let's take a look at a more mainstream setup. What we're looking at here is a somewhat more accessible system based around a Core i5-4590, a quad-core processor with no hyperthreading. This has been paired up with a Gigabyte GTX 1060. We're on the high setting here, and this is how performance is shaking out at 1080p resolution. A few caveats here. Remember, we don't have that optimized GPU driver. Secondly, the recommended specs for the game released by Square Enix include a Core i7-4770 and a GTX 1070. Firstly, this does confirm that JC4 is going to be on the demanding side at the higher settings, and secondly, well, obviously we're looking at performance from hardware here that's below recommended spec. And well, by and large, you're getting a pretty decent turnout here. We're running with VSync on here to try to hit as close to a consistent 1080p 60 as we can, and the GTX 1060 here achieves this for 95.3% of the overall duration across 40,000 tested frames. Just a quick observation here, but it does seem to be the case that Just Cause 4 on this setup at least is primarily GPU bound. It's large explosions and fill rate intensive effects that see the drops beneath 60 frames per second. Square Enix didn't have a Radeon RX 580 to hand, which, might be considered a bit of a shame because back in the day it took a long time for a driver update that fixed some pretty profound stuttering issues with Just Cause 3 on AMD hardware. However, Square Enix did have an RX 570 to hand, which delivers performance that is predictably a touch weaker than the 1060, noticeably so in some cases. However, across our run of 40-odd thousand frames, the game hit the frame rate target 94.7% of the time, not too far away from the 1060 overall. Now, we'll be taking a look at 1060 and 580 performance at launch with final optimizations in place and of course with the appropriate day one drivers in play. I'd say that per the recommended specs, running Just Cause 4 isn't going to be a walk in the park, but it looks like there's room for maneuver here in getting smooth performance even as is, and based on the build I saw on the hardware scene here at least, there's nothing untowards in terms of driver hiccups or optimization issues. Right, okay, and here's how the GTX 1080 Ti system we debuted with earlier in the video is shaping up right now with the game maxed out. So yeah, this very high setting is a notch above the high settings used for the 1080p tests. And yes, we are running at 4K resolution here. Typically we're in 40 to 45 FPS territory. Square Enix told me that the plan is for Just Cause 4 to support NVIDIA DLSS technology, which should, in theory at least, provide a substantial performance boost for NVIDIA RTX cards, even without dialing back quality settings. Obviously though, just to stress one more time, we are looking at pre-release code on a non-optimized video driver, so the real proof of the pudding will be in the tasting. So yeah, we'll be revisiting this one with final code when we can. In the meantime, here's a quick glance at the options menu. You'll note that it's actually very similar indeed to the settings that we had to play with in Just Cause 3, so I'll be interested to see if it's as scalable as that last game. Okay, so let's wrap this one up then. From what I've seen of Just Cause 4, we're looking at a genuine evolution of the series and a renewed focus on getting more, much more, out of the signature physics system. And in turn, this begs the question of what we should expect from the console builds of the game. Okay, so there were two major bottlenecks in JC3 as far as I could tell. Bandwidth from the massive explosions and a pretty fundamental CPU limitation on physics. Put the two together and the most intense combat and the most explosive scenarios could bring frame rates crashing down to 20 frames per second and even below. I've not seen the console versions yet, but what I can say is that the fundamental strategies that Avalanche is pursuing in maximizing CPU performance are the right ones. Rather than assign tasks to cores or threads specifically, a fiber-based system is used to allocate jobs across available cores. Historically, this is the approach that gets the most out of multi-core systems, and that's particularly essential for trying to pull off physics like this on a console. For its part, Square Enix has offered up this statement about the consoles. From the very start of the project, tech performance has been an absolute priority for us. Just Cause 4 is a bigger, better game than Just Cause 3, with incredible extreme weather simulations in a fully physicalized sandbox. We believe it's a real technical achievement, and we're confident that its performance is an improvement over the previous game. Improvements in visuals, frame rate stability and load times have been made on all platforms. So there you go. With the game so close to release now, we'll be sure to put all of that to the test then. Right, okay, so that's all from me for now. As always, do like and subscribe to support our work and ring the bell for instant notifications. Now, if you like what we do and want to support us more directly, please do consider the DF Patreon, where this video is available as a pristine 4K download. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.